Hi, everybody. Welcome to another week of blended virtual distance learning. We're approaching the last few weeks of the semester now, which is kind of crazy to think. Going quickly for some, slowly for others. I did want to say that I appreciate all of the hard work that you guys have been putting in over the entire semester, but especially over the last few weeks with staying connected and doing the work. I know all of you are dealing with different situations and circumstances and sharing technology, and some of you are sick. And some of you have family who are sick, and life still goes on even though we're in quarantine. So I wanted to express my appreciation for you for that. Um, excuse me, and also for your understanding of my attempt to deliver the material to the best of my ability during my own circumstances, which involve teaching 6 classes and many of them virtually from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. With little kids and a husband who teaches. So we all have our circumstances. We're all doing our best, and I'm still seeing really great work from you guys. So I'm really, really excited about this next unit that we're going into about literary magazines. We've already been reading material from literary magazines because, believe it or not, literary magazines have been around since the 1700s. A little bit earlier than that, maybe late 1600s. And we've been reading some things from literary magazines. The oldest piece that we've read from a literary magazine is Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, which originally appeared in New England Magazine in 1892, and then appeared again in her book in 1899. So that's actually a pretty common sequence still today in publishing. So while I didn't organize the class in terms of chronology, meaning we didn't start with the oldest stories and work forward, we were doing it by either convention or topic or whatever. Some weeks we had thematic, others we were looking at things like point of view and character and style and tone. We're going to be looking in the next few weeks at contemporary work and what does the short story look like now. And the place that we need to look for what the short story looks like now, as in 2020, is literary magazines, because stories that appear in literary magazines end up in story collections that you then purchase at your favorite book dealer of choice, book dealer. So that's what's different about the short story in terms of the novel, is that many short stories have their first life, I guess you could say, in a literary magazine. And so I kind of wanted to talk about that term literary, because we didn't start the semester with the question of what is literature, which I generally do in a literature course. And I think because we're hyper-focused on a specific genre, I didn't say, what is literature to you? But if I ask you the question, what is literature to you? Many of you would likely say, famous writing or stuff that you study in school, right? That's what we call the literary canon. So literary canon is that literature which is established as something that, withstands the test of time and worthy of study. What's interesting about this is that what's worthy of study has really been changing over the last 25 years or so. Initially, it used to be a very erudite, classics-styled canon, meaning Shakespeare, right? Everybody studies Shakespeare because this is serious literary merit. It's serious writing that is fiction, that is innovative, that is dramatic. Okay, who determines that, though? Who determines what is worthy of serious consideration? Because I tell you, I still have, and maybe I'll pull them out for my next video, I still have my circa 1996 X-Men comic where Jean Grey and Scott Summers get married. And maybe in the 90s it was not considered worthy of serious consideration. But if we look at the scholarship that's out there now, there is quite a bit on comic books, graphic novels being the term for compilations that are put together or standalone pieces. So, there are entire courses on the graphic novel, on Marvel Empire and whatnot, and really deep conversations about the kind of social issues, right? So when you hear literary magazine, you pick up on the word literary as coming from literature. The difference between a literary magazine and other magazines is that it's publishing the writerly voices of the now. And there's a variety of literary magazines, and we're going to talk about it. It's not just it's not just drama. There's humor literary magazines. There are graphic novel literary magazines, sci-fi, fantasy, slipstream, all sorts of different genres. But I just have here that I want you to know that literary writing is not necessarily, if it's good writing, it's literary, right? It's a term that's been evolving over time, and it will continue to evolve, right? But when you hear literary magazine, it's really referring to literature as opposed to something that is this hierarchical, up here, white, straight male literature that we're used to studying. So all semester we've been talking about how content dictates form. And these are a bunch of literary magazines, some of which are defunct now, as I'm running my cursor over this. But what the subject matter is, right, dictates the way we write the story or the way we read it. So we think about Carmen Maria Machado's The Green Ribbon. Sorry, the Husband Stitch. I always get it backwards. The Husband Stitch, which originally appeared in Granta. Granta is one of the most elite literary magazines, meaning you get paid really well to get your work in there. It's widely circulated. Circulation determines how much you get paid. So let's say it circulates at like 20,000. They have 20,000 subscriptions, print subscriptions. So that's a higher circulation. But her story first appeared in Granta, and then once she put her collection together, we now have, and I don't have it up here. I don't think I brought it up here. Her Body and Other Parties, her book. I think all but 2 of the stories in that collection were published in literary magazines. And a variety of ones too, because one of her stories, Inventory, which has to do with a pandemic of all sorts, of all topics, which I did link for you guys the other week as an optional read. That appeared in, I think it's Spaceways, Andromeda, I'm not sure, but it appeared in a speculative sci-fi fiction magazine. So they only publish genre stuff, right? So she's got Granta, which is considered like the, although the Atlantic is something we're going to talk about. It's considered like one of the premier magazines, and then you have something that's much more like genre, like not as big of a circulation, not as big of a population reading it, and all of those together create a story collection. But the content of the story dictates the form, and that dictates the venue, the best venue for it. So, and I'm sorry if this screen's cut off a little bit here, but so here's Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine. You can find this in Barnes & Noble and Camp Hill. Like, you will find fantasy and sci-fi in pretty much any Barnes & Noble. It's a really widely circulated magazine. It is still considered a literary magazine. Literary journal is the other term. Boulevard is a more experimental. And then The Atlantic, many of you probably know, is not a literary magazine, but they do publish stories. And the stories that are usually published in The Atlantic are geared more towards a popular audience, meaning they're not as genre or experimental. They adhere to a traditional plot structure with your rising action, climax, falling action. But they will have a little bit of a literary bent. They'll be a little bit above like a New York Times best-selling, James Patterson novel, which I like James Patterson, but that is, stripped down writing, a page turner, etc. So the Atlantic has, embedded in it space for short stories. But it's not entirely a literary magazine, but it's where a lot of people do get to read some of the more popular short stories, which turn into the popular short story collections that get sold. The New Yorker is another really popular magazine, which we are going to spend a whole week talking about. The New Yorker. Our very last week is the New Yorker story, which has traditionally been considered the epitome of American literary magazines. Like George Saunders recently published in there again. A lot of the canonized writers from the 70s and 80s and 90s all the way up through now, celebrated writers who are widely circulated and known by name, appear in the New Yorker. But what makes a New Yorker story is what we're going to be looking at in that last week. So literary magazines fall towards the side of alternative lit. But there are some that are more on the pop lit side. And so those ones are the ones you're going to find, again, like at Barnes & Noble on the rack, and that are going to have a higher circulation. Prism International here, and I'm seeing that this is all cut off, but Prism International is one of the, here's my copy from when I published in it. I had a couple literary magazines I was trying to pull up print copies of magazines, but it's a Canadian magazine. What makes a literary journal different? The publishing process is different from a magazine in that it's distributed not nearly as often. Prism publishes 4 times a year and only in print form. But you also have some that will print every day online. Not print, but they will publish every day online. So that's called serialized. If they are released multiple, per year or even every year, they're called serials. And that was one of the first forms of the dissemination of literature widely was through serials, which are basically what literary magazines have become today. And they've had a variety of different names. But from the top down in publishing literary magazines, you begin with the editor-in-chief, who usually in the beginning is the person who founds the magazine. And then you go through section editors. Now, Prism International publishes nonfiction, fiction, and poetry. So they'd have a fiction, nonfiction, and poetry editor, and then assistant editors. There are certain magazines that only publish poetry, like Poetry or Poetry International. Some that only publish fiction, like Fiction International. And there are some that also include book reviews, like the Chicago Review. So depending on how many sections they have, that determines how many editors they have. Many of them are run by colleges and universities, but not all of them. But in the beginning, like the mid 20th century, like in the 50s and 60s, a slew of literary magazines started coming out of colleges and universities, and a lot of them are still around today. Messiah College has a literary magazine. Gettysburg College has a literary magazine. Hack has a literary magazine. Penn State Harrisburg has a literary magazine. There are a lot of literary magazines, and actually I'll go ahead and show you here. This is my Duotrope, which is where I put my submissions through for my stuff. 7,225 poetry, nonfiction, visual art, literary magazines that are registered with Duotrope. That's a lot. But that also includes online literary magazines. And I'm going to continue onto this idea of literary magazines, online versus print, in the second video in this sequence. So I'm going to take a break here for you at the almost 15-minute mark. And I know this is a really long video, so I appreciate you guys hanging in there. So if you need to take a break, do what you need to do, and then you can start the next video.